So this is the bottom of page 119 where we left off last week. Although the subject of the path and its disciplines is considered in detail later, it is of interest to note in this connection that for those on the path, the three states are A, the beyond state of God equals unconsciousness. B, the experiences on the path equals real subconsciousness of duality. And C, roused from all illusion of duality equals real full consciousness of God or self. Mind seeks the abeyance of its consciousness in deep sleep, but it cannot continue indefinitely to accept this self-refutation. This negative achievement is not an adequate substitute for the final purpose for which consciousness came into existence. That is, for the soul to become fully conscious of itself as the infinite truth. Though man attempts through sleep to escape the burden that consciousness imposes upon him, he is involuntarily drawn back to his waking state by the impressions gathered in the achieving of the very consciousness from which he sought escape. The old bonds of desire, both fulfilled and unfulfilled, bind him to the world of illusion and propel him again into the maelstrom of finite life. Although it is only temporary, sleep does give psychological reinvigoration to the mind. If there were not some kind of restoration of psychic vitality during sleep, there would be no particular benefit to this oblivion. In spite of the apparent respite, consciousness would remain exactly as it had been at the time of its withdrawal into sleep, and no special gain would be achieved. It would be merely a fruitless interval in a long chain of automatic responses to environment. Sleep does confer positive benefit due to the fact that the separate, quote, I consciousness, end quote, is in complete abeyance during deep sleep. The individual soul is in actual union with the infinite self. When sleep is dreamless, the individual soul is resting in the undisturbed tranquility of the most original, beyond state of God. But inasmuch as sleep is a submergence of consciousness into oblivion, it does not bestow upon the soul the conscious realization of the truth that the soul will eventually experience when consciousness is freed of all impressions, good as well as bad. Even this unconscious contact with infinity, the abode of all bliss and power, gives to the mind a new tone and vigor. When consciousness returns to waking functioning, it manifests a renewed faith that at some time, in some manner, a final solution to life's complexities will be found. Although the most important work of consciousness is always done during the waking state, dreams also play their part in helping consciousness through the maze of problems which beset it. As a rule, consciousness passes through the dream state during the transition from waking to sleep, and while returning from sleep to waking. The dream state serves as a bridge between sleep and waking, but it is not an inevitable phase. The mind may swing between quiescence and waking without subconsciously passing through the dream phase. In the dream state, consciousness is not completely dormant as in sleep, nor is it fully active as in waking. The dream state is midway between these two phases, and it marks a transition from latent consciousness to active consciousness. The unique virtue of the ordinary dream state is that experiences in it are relatively free from the act of willing, as well as from the rigid social demands which prevail in conscious life. Despite the seeming lawlessness of the dream state, it is nevertheless subject to the accumulated mental and emotional impressions, sanskaras, which function as inexorably in the dream state as in the waking. Many inclinations and desires which cannot find fulfillment in waking life seek and find gratification in the self-created, subjective world of dreams. Likewise, many fears and conflicts buried in the subconscious mind inflict upon the dreamer a diversity of suffering, which the conscious mind would seek to avoid. Thus, dreamland also invites the experiencing of the opposites. The unique characteristic of dream experiences is that they afford an opportunity to work out a number of the sanskaric impressions without creating any new physical bondage. Many dreams have the same force and directive value that inhere in experiences of the waking state. But these latter are always accompanied by the simultaneous creation of new emotional and mental impressions, sanskaras, that prove to be just as binding as the age-old impressions that limit man's consciousness. Dream experiences, however, result in no such creation of further bindings. Another interesting aspect of ordinary dreams is that regardless of what the dream entails, it has no direct effect on any mind other than the dreamer. This is quite contrary to experiences in the conscious waking state. These invariably involve and affect many other souls as well, thus complicating many life patterns. The activity of consciousness in the waking state creates a bondage of karmic liabilities and assets from which dream experiences are exempt. The dream world is a type of psychic experimental laboratory, insulated from the demands of physical life and thus possessing some advantage over the waking state. But because it does not give play to the directive faculty of the will and isolates the individual soul from other souls, it also suffers severe handicaps from which the waking life is free. In spite of the periodic release and refreshment that deep sleep supplies, the mind continues to be dissatisfied, driven by need to escape from the burden that finite consciousness imposes upon him. Man associates himself with like-minded individuals. By merging himself in a group that has similar problems, he hopes to fortify himself against his growing sense of dissatisfaction. But his hope is ill-founded. He finds no more redemption by identifying himself with the false we than by identifying with the false I. The increased strength of the group is nullified by increased expectations. Instead of finding his powerlessness mitigated, the individual finds that it is merely shared by many others. His sense of helplessness is accentuated through participation in the group consciousness, for he shares their collective feeling of helplessness as well as his own. Although occasionally a means may be found to eliminate some one worry in life, the final solution to recurring problems remains to be found. Suppose, for example, that a man is extremely miserable because others in his office seem to be given better treatment than he. Then suppose he is suddenly relieved of all his worries by inducing himself in a studied indifference to his surroundings. This may give him a temporary feeling of release from his problems, but since his troubles are really caused by lack of understanding of himself and environment, his cultivated indifference really leaves the situation completely unchanged. Sooner or later, when his forced indifference cracks and he again becomes emotionally involved, his old worries return to disturb him as before. His attitude of detachment fails to affect a permanent change in his consciousness because it is not based upon the truth that there is but one infinite self, which is the self of all. To know oneself honestly and understand one's environment requires a radical change in outlook. Mechanical coercion of the mind into a temporary attitude is not sufficient, for the mind has a tendency to revert to its age-old inclinations, habit patterns, sanskaric patterns, and to free itself from any position into which it may have been forced. Unless the mind achieves intelligent discrimination based on lasting values, it is inevitably harassed by its self-created worries. Again and again, man must seek the oblivion of sleep as a necessary respite from participation in things of little satisfaction. Man clings to the palliative experiences of the gross world, even though they augment the very worries, sufferings, and defeats from which his consciousness desires to escape. Only in the extremity of despair does consciousness gather sufficient momentum to try to break through the constricting web of ego life and into the life of lasting freedom. When man realizes at last that his helplessness is the product of his countless cravings, he tries to find peace by renouncing those cravings and accepting life in a spirit of resignation to the divine will. Until that moment of supreme self-determination occurs, however, he finds himself persistently haunted by an overpowering desire to perpetuate his self-created ego life. Although he tries desperately to break through the self-centered isolation that this life fosters, it is only when he surrenders to a perfect master that he is initiated sooner or later into the path of redemptive love. Surrender to the will of the master is in itself very difficult, but it becomes more so under the gaze of friendly onlookers. To them, the actions of the spiritual aspirant often seem incomprehensible, as if he were sacrificing his most precious possession, his free will. Often it seems to the onlooker that the master aims only to increase his own prestige by directing the actions of those who surround him. This falls far short of understanding the work of the master, just as it is necessary for solder to be fluxed in a salt before it can join the two metal parts together. It is necessary for the soul of the seeker to be bathed through self-surrenderance in the light that the master affords. The master gains nothing. It is not his purpose to gain. Certainly his ego cannot be exalted, for if he is a perfect master, he has already lost it. When a man determines to find peace and fulfillment through the renunciation of the cravings of the ego life, he finds that his new decision is challenged more by the deep-rooted compulsions of his own mind than by any obstructive factors in the external environment. Although he now longs to love the master wholeheartedly as the divine beloved and tries to surrender completely to him, he is far from being master of his own mind. He cannot even surrender the things he regards as his own, despite his sincere decision. Like Janus, the aspirant has two faces, one looking longingly at the truth, the other at ignorance. On the one hand, the aspirant yearns for the saving grace of the master and to be completely lost in the unbounded truth that he senses in the master. On the other hand, his false separative ego tries to perpetuate its existence by all available means. But with the first surrender to the master, the death knell of the ego life is sounded. And though it continues to struggle for survival, its days of dominance are numbered. If a person is caught in a quagmire, he instinctively tries every means to get out of it. But the very effort he makes thrusts him deeper into it. The more he struggles, the further in he sinks. Help must come to him then from someone who stands on firm ground and who can only be of help when the struggling man has ceased to struggle long enough to look about for aid. There is a certain similarity between this situation and the case of the individual who has surrendered his life to the master. The false separative ego tries its utmost to postpone its own dissolution by resisting the divine love of the master. It struggles in the quagmire of existence, but each act of ego affirmation invites a reaction of deep surrender to the beloved's will. This in turn brings with it the clearer realization of the master as being none other than the irresistible truth that is the self of all selves, and the one reality in the apparent multiplicity of individual souls. Truth realization is born of such complete surrender to the engulfing love of God, of which the master is the physical symbol and the channel. The finite self has now not only recognized itself as hopelessly limited, but also as utterly false. It ceases to make any claims or to protest in its own right, offering itself instead to the infinite truth. This offering of purified will redounds to its own advantage. When finite consciousness of the mind, in its stark awareness of futility and falseness, capitulates wholly to the infinite truth, the soul becomes consciously one with that truth in self-realization. Only then can consciousness be said really to have arrived at its final destination. Originally absorbed in the infinite, consciousness is now absorbed by the infinite, now consciously experiencing its own unlimited power, knowledge, bliss, and scope. In being absorbed by the infinite, consciousness is completely freed of one and all illusions and can be called superconsciousness, in which state its former unlimited helplessness is transmuted into unlimited power. The aim of life and the real goal of all creation is to achieve true self-consciousness. When the mind of man is transformed into superconsciousness of the soul, it inherits the treasure of omnipotence, and there is no recurrence of that sense of helplessness that had haunted his dreaming and waking states. No longer is there need for consciousness to be submerged into the oblivion of sleep in order to achieve unconscious union of the self with the universal self. The conscious union that the individual self has now established with the universal self is an unfading attainment that persists forever. In the unlimited abundance of superconsciousness, the freed soul experiences no curtailment or cessation. In superconsciousness, the soul experiences itself as almighty. Its bliss is unbounded, and its continuous awareness of itself as the infinite truth admits no slightest interruption by the self-forgetfulness of ordinary sleep, dream, or wake state. Ordinary waking consciousness of the mind is not only incapable of realizing the true self, but is deluded to accept the false limited self and the false multiplicity of the phenomenal world as real. It is therefore a form of ignorance. Superconsciousness may be termed supra-waking because this state has transcended all normal limitations and has become truly whole in the sense that it retains no element of illusion. It is the opposite of ordinary sleep, for oblivion of the truth is complete in ordinary sleep, while awareness of truth is complete in superconsciousness. When waking consciousness invades and consciously illumines the depths of forgetfulness, ignorance, and illusion, it becomes transmuted into supra-waking consciousness. Mahu, are you ready to read?
Yes. Yes, I'm ready. Chapter 3. Origins and effects of war. The basic causes of the social turmoil that often precipitates into war may be found in the individual, the social whole, the functioning of Maya, and in the very intent of God's will. Inasmuch as these are essentially one in the final analysis, this means no more than that war is a part of the divine pattern. Insofar as war affects the individual, however, it may be understood at all the levels within illusion from which it is precipitated. The first is the level of the individual himself. It may readily be seen that most persons are immersed in their own egos and selfish viewpoints. This is the life of illusory values in which men are caught. If man were to face the truth, he would understand that all life is one, and in this understanding, forget the limited self. But man does not face the truth regarding himself as separate from and competing with the rest of mankind. This attitude often breeds a concept of personal happiness that creates lust for power, unbridled greed, and unrelieved hatred. Ignorant of the real purpose of life, many persons sink to the lowest level of culture, burying themselves in and contributing to the decay of forms lingering on from the dead past. Bound by material interest and a limited viewpoint, they forget their divine destiny. They have truly lost their way, and so they lay savagely about themselves, for their hearts are torn by fear and hate. The second level from which wars are bred is that of the social whole. Here, economic pressures are often cited as a major cause. Also, resistance to aggression seems a reasonable cause. It would be an illusion within illusion, however, to claim that wars arise merely to secure material adjustment. It would be an illusion within illusion, however, to claim that wars arise merely to secure material adjustment. They are more often the products of uncritical identification with narrow interests, which, through association, finally come to be regarded as one's sole rights. To profess the humanity's problem is merely that of greed, is to reduce humanity to the level of animality. If man chooses to set himself the limited task of securing purely material adjustment, he must understand and be guided by the spiritual ramifications of this simple goal. Economic adjustment cannot be divorced from a spiritual context. Economic adjustment can be achieved only as people realize there can be no planned cooperative action in economic matters without the replacing of self-interest with self-giving love. Failing this fundamental requisite, the attainment of highest efficiency in production will only lead to a further sense of insufficiency and a new conflict. A profound spirit of self-giving love must underlie all effort to solve and remove economic pressures leading towards war. While material adjustment can only be regarded as a part of the wide problem of spiritual adjustment, spiritual adjustment in turn requires the elimination of self. It must be removed from all those phases which affect the intellectual, emotional, and cultural war rests upon the spiritual enlightenment of the individual. This need not mean that wars are inevitable as of life, for war is only the most explosive gross manifestation of the combined egocentricity of mankind. But conflict of one sort of another is inevitable until the ego self is finally tamed and eliminated.
Mahu, dear, could you repeat this paragraph?
Sure.
I think you missed a line somehow.
Oh, I did. Okay, I thought so. Okay. All right. While material adjustment can only be regarded as a part of the wider problem of the spiritual adjustment, a spiritual adjustment in turn requires the elimination of self. It must be removed from all those phases which affect the intellectual, emotional, and cultural life of man. It may be readily seen then that a solution to the individual and social factors underlying war rests upon the spiritual enlightenment of the individual. This need not mean that wars are inevitable, as long as the ego self of the individual continues to ride rampant in the cultural and economic areas of life. For war is only the most explosive gross manifestation of the combined egocentricity of mankind. But conflict of one sort or another is inevitable until the ego self is finally tamed and eliminated. As man faces the truth and begins to appreciate that all humanity, nay, all creation, is one, the problem of wars will commence to disappear. Wars must be clearly seen by all to be both unnecessary and unreasonably, that the immediate problem will not be to stop wars, but to wage them spiritually against the attitude of mind which generated them. In the light of the truth of the unity of all, a cooperative and harmonious life becomes inevitable. Thus, the chief task for those who set out to rebuild humanity after a great war is to do their utmost to dispel the spiritual ignorance that envelopes humanity. The disease of selfishness in mankind will need a cure that is not only universal in application, but drastic in nature, Selfishness is so deep-rooted that it can be eradicated only by being attacked from all sides. Real peace and happiness will dawn spontaneously when selfishness is purged. The peace and happiness that come from self-giving love are permanent. Again, the peace and happiness that come from self-giving love are permanent. Even the worst sinner can become a great saint if he has the courage and sincerity to invite a drastic and complete change of heart. The levels from which war springs have not yet been exhausted. The third is that of Maya. When truly understood, all conflicts and wars are seen to be a part of the divine game. They are thus a result of the divine will, which finds expression in the world of manifestation through the medium of Maya. The cosmic power, through the medium of Maya, the cosmic power that causes the illusory world of duality to appear as real. The purpose served by Maya is twofold. One, it can be instrumental in trapping the mind in the duality of illusion. And two, it can also be instrumental in freeing the mind from the grip of spiritual ignorance and bondage. Maya should not be ignored. It must be handled with detachment and understanding. Wars are the work of Maya and are either spiritually disastrous or beneficial depending on whether they are based on attachment to or detachment from the whole of Maya. The final level from which the cause of war spring is no level at all, for it is a part of the divine plan of God to give to a hungry and weary world a fresh dispensation of the eternal and only truth. During war, great forces of destruction are afoot, which at times might seem to be dominant. But constructive forces for the redemption of humanity are also released through various channels. Though the working of these latter forces is largely silent, eventually they are bound to bring about the transformations that will render safe and steady the further spiritual progress of humanity. Regardless of the political and economic factors described by the historian as he looks at war in retrospect, from the spiritual point of view, this sanguine phenomenon is a cyclic divine ferment over which no earthly power has control. There are always two aspects of divinity that are eternally active in the affairs of the world. In Persian, the destructive aspect of divinity is termed self-glorification, and the constructive aspect, self-beatitude. When the self-glorification aspect of God predominates, there is destruction and suffering on a colossal scale, as in the last World War. The aspect of divine beatitude, on the other hand, brings peace and plenty. These are usually the golden ages of civilization. During the phase of self-glorification, divine repels itself, so to speak, through its own creation, while in the phase of self-beatitude, divinity attracts or loves itself through its own creation. The former is a negative method, the latter positive, but must be regarded ultimately as instruments of divine wisdom to rouse humanity to its divine heritage of self-realization. When the individual or the race is about to lapse into bestiality, it is suffering that rehabilitates them. Both the self-glorification and self-beatitude phases of God are exerted in cyclic waves and affect individuals and the race with similar intensity. As the destructive phase now begins to weaken, the constructive cycle of divine beatitude will gradually make itself felt. Just as the recent World War catastrophe overwhelmed the innocent as well as the guilty, so in the approaching self-beatitude phase, the undeserving as well as deserving will have equal chance of receiving divine grace, provided they are awake to the situation. So full and unique a cycle dispensation it will be. Ethics in time of war can only be judged by the degree to which they reflect the divine plan. In war, there are two kinds of forces operative. One, those which make for love, justice, harmony, and the well-being of all mankind. And two, those which work in alliance with narrow racial and national loyalties towards the selfish exploitations of others. Nevertheless, although the last great war brought great suffering and destruction upon millions of people, it was not in vain, for out of its chaos there will be emerged a new world of freedom, happiness, and understanding. He who would wage war must search his heart and make sure that the ends for which he is fighting are a reflection of the divine plan. His actions will be justified only if they help to lead humanity to spiritual brotherhood, cemented by an inviolable sense of the unity of all human beings, regardless of class, color, nationality, race, religion, or creed. One might ask how it is that at one time the cause of war seemed rooted in individual human selfishness, and at another in racial and economic pressures which transcend the individual, and at still another in the divine plan of God. And how can the individual help be striving to whittle down his own ego if the outlines of war already exist in God's text of the past and future? The answers to this sincere query had best be offered by means of an analogy. One's eyes see that an apple has a rosy color, and it is said that the apple is red. One's nose may savor the aroma of the apple, and the apple is said to smell fragrant. When one takes the apple in one's hands, its skin is found to be smooth and cool, and when one bites into it, the apple is found to be sweet and succulent. All these sensations are coordinated in some fashion by one's consciousness into the notion of one apple that has many attributes. Its succulence is no more to be denied a place in the reality of the apple than is its aroma or its color. It is recognized intuitively that all traits belong to the same apple, despite the fact that the sensations enter consciousness through different windows. Whether the object exists partially or totally in the realm of reality or only in illusion is of little interest for the purposes of the analogy. The reality of the apple, then, has many separate facets as interpreted by one's senses. One suspects that it would have even more if only the mind were not limited in its perceptual capability by the types of location of the windows that are open to it. Just as the apple possesses a variety of unarguable properties, all of which belong to the same object, so other objects and organisms often give evidence of numerous aspects of reality. The same fact in life looks different, therefore, to different people. To different people, its appearance being determined by the particular window of their spiritual nature from which the individual looks. From this emerges one vital principle. Each person must look at cause and effect from the window that is natural to him. To try to see through all the windows is to risk stagnation in the complexity of a whirlpool of intellectual facts that can never be integrated by intellectual means. To try to argue another out of the seeming world of reality that he sees from his window is to argue the unarguable. Roundness is as real to the apple as its fragrance, until one day both are lost in perception of the entirety. So also it will seem to some that the causes of war lie wholly within the responsibility of the individual. For others, society will be the cause. Still others will see the hand of Maya, and some will see the will of God. During a war, there are persons who unveil their inherent higher self through the endurance of pain and by acts of bravery and self-sacrifice. It is better that such unselfish action be released under the stimulus of danger than not released at all. It is better that men forget their pretty selves under the pressure of the collective calamity, if need be, than remain permanently absorbed in fear and greed. Great suffering awakens great understanding in man. Supreme suffering fulfills its purpose when it awakens him finally to genuine longing for real understanding. Unprecedented suffering leads to unprecedented spiritual results. It contributes to the basing of life on an unshakable foundation of truth. The individual must understand fully his identity with the Supreme Universal Soul. Having perceived this truth, he will find that his life rearranges spontaneously so that his attitude towards his neighbor in everyday life becomes different. Then he will act upon the spiritual value of oneness, which promotes true cooperation. Brotherhood is a spontaneous outcome of true perception. The new life for the individual is based upon a spiritual understanding and is an affirmation of a spiritual practicality in the truth. Just as war is not an unmixed evil for the individual, so it may have certain forward propelling effects on humanity as a whole. The destructiveness of war tends to bring humanity to a spiritual crisis born of this physical nightmare. Again, the destructiveness of war tends to bring humanity to a spiritual crisis born of the physical nightmare. Inevitably, suffering and misery pose the question of what it all leads to, how it will all end. Gradually, people become sick of wanting and sick of fighting. Greed and hatred finally reach such an intensity that everyone becomes wary of them. Then mankind begins to suspect that the only way out is through selflessness. The only alternative to war and its suffering is seen to be to stop hating and to love, to stop wanting and to give, to stop dominating and to serve. Wars require the exercise of cooperative functioning, and in this resides one positive result. Still, the value of this cooperation should not be overestimated, for too often it is artificially restricted by identification with a limited group of or ideal.
Thank you, Mahu. So next week we'll pick up at top of page 134.